All right, good morning, everyone. Deeru, do you want to remind everybody of the format that you established for this? Because I can't remember it offhand after I introduce everybody. So this gentleman here is Justin Shubow. He's the president of the National Civic Art Society. It's a society, not an association. On his right is Harriet Tregoning, who's director of a group called the New Urban Mobility Alliance and also served a term or two as director of the Office of Planning. Brian O'Looney, who's a partner at Torti, Gallas and Partners, done a number of buildings in the District of Columbia, well-versed with the issues of the height limit, I'm sure. And another former director of the Office of Planning, McCarthy, who also is a partner in a company called the Urban Partnership. So maybe, Dee, you can remind everybody of the format. Oh, it's up here? Here it is.
No, it's the format that you just read.
Okay.
And 15 minutes each.
Oh, so they each get 15 minutes, starting with Justin. And then Harriet, and then, oh, look, they sat in order. Did we plan that? That's pretty good. Not bad, not bad. Okay, so everybody gets 15 minutes. We have a person indicating the time there. So you want to come up here, Justin, and you can start. And then once we get everybody through with their presentations, we will open it up for discussion, debate, and unfounded accusations and things.
That's right. And the last half hour, the audience has a chance to comment and ask questions, etc. So, thanks.
It's an honor to be here today, participating in a debate with planners who have done so much for improving living standards in Washington, D.C. The nation's capital is an anomaly among major American cities in having a height limit, indeed a strong one. But height limits have a long history in this country and indeed around the world. After all, skylines are no small matter. When we think of cities, it is so often skylines that we envisage. Think of Florence, Rome, and Paris. Here is a visualization of various American city skylines side by side. Clearly, one of them is not like the other. Washington, D.C. It is a fundamentally horizontal city, the only major American city to lack any high-rise buildings. The architect and planner Leon Creer illustrated the values implied in an urban skyline in his ideogram of the two realms of the city. The first being the res publica, the civic and cultural buildings that embody the city's highest values. The second realm is that of the res economica or privata, the private realm. When you combine the two realms, as he believes ought to be the case in the best designed cities, one sees that the res publica stands out both in architectural expression and height, while the res economica has a more subdued design that is more uniform and lower in height. Thus, the hierarchy of values is clear. As early as the 1880s, Americans had started looking for ways of stopping tall buildings. They said that such buildings were turning the streets below into dark and gloomy canyons, which were ice cold during the winter. Many Americans believed that tall buildings were smothering architectural and historical landmarks out of existence. They believed that European cities were so dignified, restrained, and beautiful due to their skylines, which are composed of ordinary buildings of a low, even cornice line, broken only by the spires and towers of churches, monuments, and important public buildings. They were cities of horizontal monumentality. Paris and a few other cities put height limits into place going back to the 18th century. As late as 1913, virtually all European cities imposed stringent height limits. Americans' efforts to impose height restrictions were by and large successful by the 1910s. Los Angeles would keep a height limit until 1957, Boston would keep its until the 1960s, and San Francisco its limits until 1967. Among the conspicuous holdouts to height limits, however, were New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. Chicago, the birthplace of the skyscraper, would go back and forth on them. Which brings me to height limits in Washington. As you know, DC was established as the nation's capital, a federal city placed under the jurisdiction of Congress. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Pierre L'Enfant planned the city as a tabula rasa on mostly vacant land. It was a new capital worthy of a new republic, a grand classical scheme of an irregular grid with radiating streets and wide boulevards whose geometrical arrangement symbolically focuses on the Capitol, the White House, and the Washington Monument. The topographic setting is important for L'Enfant's plan, since it took advantage of the flat area located in the center of a triangular-shaped topographic bowl. The plan visually connected significant topographical sites, such as Jenkins Hill, where the U.S. Capitol building would be placed. Important structures, monuments, and fountains were to be erected at significant sites, and views to and from the sites were integral to the plan. This shows roughly the northern boundary of the L'Enfant city, and here it is on a more modern topographical map. While the L'Enfant plan was silent on building heights, President Washington issued the first building height regulations for the city in 1791, concerned as much about structural and fire safety as about urban design. While George Washington's regulations were suspended for a time, President Jefferson wrote that he personally hoped the new capital would emulate Paris with buildings, quote, low and convenient, and the streets light and airy. For the next 100 or so years, Washington developed without any tall buildings except for the U.S. Capitol, whose dome was completed in 1863 at a height of 289 feet. Of course, there was also the Washington Monument, completed in 1884 at a height of 555 feet. Building heights were limited not by law, but by tradition, lack of demand, and technological limitations. However, in 1894, there was a major shock when the 165-foot tall Cairo apartments were constructed. The steel-framed building towered over a low-rise neighborhood just north and west of the White House. The District Commission, the body appointed by Congress to manage the city, responded to public complaints by enacting regulations limiting building heights no wider than adjacent streets, with maximum heights of 90 feet on residential streets and 100 feet on commercial streets. In 1899, Congress, apparently responding to public demands, enacted the first height legislation for DC, which was not that different from the prior regulations, except it distinguished between so-called combustible and non-combustible buildings, showing that the ability to fight fires was a major concern. But supporters of the bill also focused on the prospect of tall buildings blocking light and air. The upper height limit was 130 feet for non-combustible buildings constructed on 160-foot wide avenues. The limit was not arbitrarily chosen. Congress had sent a commission to Europe to study height limits in cities such as London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, and also to look at American cities, most of which had height limits. The commission settled on a height limit that followed a well-established urban design precedent, namely, the height of buildings should be related to the width of the street on which they stand. In 1910, Congress enacted a new comprehensive law commonly referred to as the Height Act. The act, which has been slightly amended over time, remains in effect today and includes the following restrictions. In mixed-use or commercial areas, buildings may be as high as the width of the street plus 20 feet, but may not exceed 130 feet. In residential areas, heights are limited to 90 feet. On the north side of Pennsylvania Avenue, between 1st and 15th Streets, buildings can rise to 160 feet. To step back one bit, when explaining how Washington came to achieve its iconic design, it's crucial to mention the 1901-1902 Macmillan Plan that furthered and developed L'Enfant's plan. Composed of luminaries in architecture, landscaping, and planning, the Macmillan Commission extended the National Mall and created the monumental core as we know it. While the plan did not explicitly specify building heights, there are no tall buildings in the plan, and an internal memo among the commission which was highly influenced by its tour of European cities, seems to suggest keeping some kind of height limit. One also suspects that the architect Daniel Burnham, the heaviest hand in the plan, would have supported a height limit given that in his 1909 plan for Chicago, the only tall buildings were civic and cultural ones, with the other buildings being of a uniform lower height. In any event, since the 1910 Height Act, in downtown and other highly valued commercial areas, buildings in Washington generally rise 10 to 11 stories. Developers have tended to max out their allowance, with the result that most buildings in these areas have the same height. Thus, in these districts, Washington is essentially a mid-rise city, but most of the city is low-rise. The most prominent structures in terms of height are the U.S. Capitol and Washington Monument, while view corridors emphasize these structures along with the White House, Lincoln Memorial, and Jefferson Memorial. The vistas are extraordinarily long. The views from the Virginia side of the Potomac are breathtaking, and the view from an airplane approaching Reagan Airport is truly thrilling. It is fair to say that the height limit has, in effect, become the highly regarded third dimension of the L'Enfant and Macmillan plans. The plan, skyline, and urban feel of the city is unique in America. In a country of generic mid-sized cities, Washington is distinctive and memorable. The symbolism is clear. This is the nation's capital. The foremost buildings and structures are those devoted to government and our national identity. The civic good is the highest good, not that of commerce and business interests. But, as urban planner Larry Beasley has said, quote, "The Height Act's effect is not just about expressing national power. It's about the joyful pleasure of walking down a gently scaled street, of unexpectedly coming upon a magnificent public edifice that stands proudly superior to the mundane buildings around it. It's about the frantic life of our modern world being made more bearable," unquote. As Thomas Jefferson desired, Washington is a city of light and air, one that is humanly scaled. The most convincing way to argue for keeping the height limit is to show just what Washington would look like with changes to the law. Here is the view today from the Capitol looking down the mall to the White House. And here is the view with a 200-foot height limit in the so-called L'Enfant city. Scaled. The most convincing way to argue for keeping the height limit is to show just what Washington would look like with changes to the law. Here is the view today from the Capitol looking down the mall to the White House. And here is the view with a 200-foot that is height limit in the allowing heights downtown to go up to 200 feet on streets that are 160 feet wide. Here is a map showing all such streets in purple. And your office proposed eliminating any height limit outside of the L'Enfant city. Faced with this proposal, the City Council voted 12-1 in support of the Height Act. The only member who didn't vote for it was Marion Barry. This past January, Mayor Muriel Bowser proposed that the height limit in certain areas downtown be raised from 130 feet to 160 feet. Ironically, in 2014, as a mayoral candidate, she said that she did not support changes to the Height Act. She said, quote, "Our skyline is in itself historic and is a treasure for the whole nation, and I think it's important that we protect that." Now let's look at the effects of quote-unquote moderate increases. Here is the view from the Jefferson Memorial to the White House today. And here it is with a uniform height increase to 130 feet. And here it is at 160 feet, the maximum height currently allowed on Pennsylvania Avenue. And this is 200 feet. Remember, this is the height limit that the DC Office of Planning was proposing for 160-foot wide streets in 2013. I'm sorry? No, I know, this is the height, this is far beyond 160-foot streets. Here's the view down North Capitol Street today, which has a 90-foot limit. And here it is with a 130-foot limit. And here with 160 feet. Here's the view farther out on Maryland Avenue today. Here it is with 130 feet limit, and here 160 feet. Now, some people have called for raising the height limit only just outside the L'Enfant City area. Here is a view down Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast showing such a vantage point today. Here it is with a 130-foot limit, and here with 160 feet. Some supporters of raising height limits say they're only calling for slight increases in certain areas, but even minor increases will inevitably lead to higher and higher limits that spread, that metastasize. Real estate is the most slippery of slopes. That the height limit has survived so long may be a fluke of politics, but it is no accident that Franklin Delano Roosevelt called DC the loveliest city in the world. Thank you.
Have you been to Paris? FDR.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So a couple of pieces of context that I didn't think I'd have to go into, but I will. A couple people have mentioned it this morning, and you might have covered it a little bit yesterday. The District of Columbia was created as a federal city, right? Under the purview of Congress, and it wasn't until 1974 where something called the Home Rule Act was passed, where we got any of the rights to elect our own leaders that every other city, town, and village in America has. Even and today, while we can now vote for president because we weren't able to do that, we don't have any representation in Congress, not any voting representation, and that's why the federal government can repeal laws that our district residents have passed, 700,000 of us. The federal government can prevent us from spending our own locally raised money on things like abortion. They can do all kinds of things. They can look at police reform laws that we've passed, and they can overturn them. So in a lot of ways, the conversation about the Hyde Act is a conversation about democracy, right? So even if we were to abolish the federal Hyde Act, if the Congress were to act, and for 100 years, Congress never asked the District of Columbia how the Hyde Act was working for us. But in 2011, 2012, a California congressman, a Republican, Darrell Issa, asked the question, called the question, hey, we've had this Hyde Act for 100 years, how's it going? And honestly, if it had been 10 years earlier, we might have said, everything's cool, it's fine, no worries. But in fact, after 7 decades of population loss, the district was actually starting to grow again, and people were moving back to the district. And we've never even done an analysis of what our development capacity would be relative to our growth. So we basically took the question that the congressman raised and did some analysis. And a lot of what you just saw was actually material that we developed as part of the dialogue we wanted to have in the city about democracy and about the height of buildings. And I think the most important thing to say is if the District of Columbia had been successful persuading Congress to change the Hyde Act, which we did get some changes, but take it away, not the height of a single building in the district would actually be able to change unless we acted locally to change our zoning laws. So it's not a slam dunk that if you got rid of the federal Hyde Act that we'd have tall buildings everywhere. We already restrict the height of buildings below the Hyde Act in many, many parts of the city because we like a city that's walkable, that's human scaled, that's beautiful, that protects view sheds, that's friendly for pedestrians. Pennsylvania Avenue is a great example of a street that's important for views. You can see down Pennsylvania Avenue for a long, long way, down 16th Street for a long, long way. for views of the White House, we locally restricted the zoning on that street and the setbacks so that you would have that continued beautiful view shed. So that's the context. It's not that, oh, height is wonderful and we wanted 200-foot limits everywhere, but rather we wanted the ability to decide, and we wanted to have a dialogue with our citizens about how height, what kind of considerations about height were we talking about? What's the largest height that we thought might be appropriate? And what are the distinctions between the federal city, which a lot of people have shown on diagrams? It used to be called Boundary Street, what we now call Florida Avenue, and the rest of the city, where it's hard to argue that there's a strong federal interest. Okay. I don't want to be the one who can't do this.
It's really easy.
That's helpful. All right, so it turns out several other presenters have covered all this material, but the bottom line, that the Hyde Act conversation was about federal control and about local control, and that DC would still have to establish the heights of buildings as our own decision. And everyone talked about this, which I think is important, that the height of buildings, relating it to the width of streets, is an urban design principle. And there's no one number, right, that we've universally adopted, but we've said that relationship is important for the sense of enclosure, for the scale, for people walking on a street. And that, you know, we've complained a lot about the suburbs because the streets are enormously wide, the setbacks are huge with parking in the front, and then there's this little one-story building right at the end, and how horrible that feels, how fast that causes people to drive because there's no sense of enclosure. So we know that the height of buildings actually really matters to how you feel about walking down a street, so it's important. But people also made reference to the fact that why, if it's working well, why would you change anything? You know, why would you do that? So quickly, we're a growing city. We were seeing even in 2011, rising prices, and who knows what the future of our city will be, but we made projections about different rates of growth and what that would mean for housing prices, for land values, and what kind of pressure that would put on people, right? Most of the land in DC is not developable for lots of reasons, but 50% of the land is off our tax rolls, right? 50% of the land, because it's federally owned, because it's municipally owned, because nonprofits don't pay property taxes. We have a large daytime population. We more than double the size of our population during the day, at least pre-pandemic, with workers who come to DC, use our services, use our infrastructure, don't pay anything to be here. And we can't ever pass a commuter tax like a lot of cities have. Why? Because that would be immediately overturned by the US Congress, because Maryland and Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania legislators who have people who work here would absolutely not allow it, right? Now, if we're talking about now, incentives to convert some of that office space to housing, might be a good reason. Changing commute and work patterns, right, might mean new demands for housing and mixed-use development in different parts of the city. So these are all reasons to think, as every city thinks, about whether changes might be appropriate. Oh, wrong way. So this is something that's also been shown, that we had a population of almost 800,000 at one time, but we had many decades, many years where our population was shrinking. We were not unlike other American cities. But we are growing again, and anyone who lives here can tell you, housing is crazy. Prices are crazy. Back in 2012, when we were doing this analysis, the other thing about the district is that we have really invested in affordable housing and trying to help make sure that the people who lived a long time in DC can afford to stay in DC. Even though we had in 2012 11% of the region's population, we provided 42% of the region's affordable housing, right? Limited land for growth. Only 4.9% has any capacity for growth. And we didn't think about growth being appropriate everywhere. All the areas in red are areas where we wouldn't consider changing the height limits.
Yeah, that's what we're here for.
Yep. So we really focus just on the areas that aren't in red. Oh, wrong way. And here in red, this is where we thought more height might make for better urbanism. And it very much matches where the zoning at the time basically designated medium and high density areas. And these were core principles that we agreed with the National Capital Planning Commission, of which I was a member, that we would consider, right? That we wanted to maintain the horizontality of the skyline. We wanted to ensure the prominence of federal landmarks and monuments, and we wanted to minimize impacts to the historically significant resources, including the L'Enfant Plan. That being said, right, the fire suppression concerns that were so prominent in the 1910 Hyde Act don't exist anymore. If you really want an urban design-based standard, why not just make a standard? So, you know, some people have suggested 1-to-1. We might hear about a higher ratio that might be based on the golden mean, which would be larger. Here, the proposal was 1 to 1.25, which on our very widest streets would permit 200-foot buildings on 160-foot wide streets. Outside the L'Enfant Plan, we basically said, let us decide. It's not a federal interest, right? We would probably keep these same principles, but what is the federal interest in restricting our height across the city? And whatever we do, we would want to protect the view sheds. We care about it as much as anybody else. We don't need a congressman from Iowa to tell us, you know, what's important about our own city. Whoops. That's the existing ratio. This is a map that shows the streets that would be affected and what the various rights of way are. And the ones that are in dark blue, those are the ones that are 160-foot wide avenues. Those are our biggest streets, and that's where 200-foot buildings might be allowed if views did not interrupt them, right? So view sheds protected. So this is an example of Pennsylvania Avenue. It's our widest street. All the buildings on the right have historic protection, so nothing would happen with those buildings. On the left, you can see what 200 feet looks like. Right now, most people don't even know that on the north side of the street, we have 160-foot buildings. They don't even notice it because Pennsylvania Avenue is so wide. Like, there's hardly a non-architect in the city that you could ask if we had, you know, where are the tallest buildings? They couldn't tell you because they don't notice it, because it is consistent with the width of the street. Taller buildings can absolutely be accommodated. We also talked about, well, outside the L'Enfant City, what might we do inside and outside? Well, more height everywhere doesn't make any sense. Part of the reason we made those drawings uniform and made the with no decoration in those mock-ups of what height might look like was to sort of rule some things out. We didn't want to have uniform height. We don't have uniform height now, even though it's we have a height limit. We have a lot of variability, and the variability is interesting, and we don't have the demand to support it. So we also talked about where height might go in other places, often around metro stations, and what those clusters might look like if maximum height were to occur. And again, view sheds, the visual impacts, both at the plan level and at the street level. And I'll stop with that. And Ellen, when she has a chance to rebut, will say more. Thank you.
Well, I'll get right into it because I don't have a lot of time and I got a lot to cover. All right. So there are a lot of attitudes about what makes the right proportion for a city. If you look at Christopher Alexander's book, he would insist that 4-story limit is the absolute cap, and there's abundant evidence to show that high buildings make people crazy. And I don't think we agree with that, but we nonetheless want to talk about a number of other attitudes about what heights could be. Like Leon Creer says you can have 3 to 5 floors, and a floor could be 40 feet if you want. Victor Dover and John Massengale in their book showed some traditional proportions and talked about the comfortable streets being 1-to-1 or 1 to 1.5. There have been a number of folks that came before me defending the Height Act to leave well enough alone. Vincent Scully in the Jefferson Lecture in '95, Larry Beasley and Whittle, I can't even say Rubisky. Someone help me here. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Jeff Racer from Cincinnati did this quick study of of comfortable street proportions, and if you look carefully, he felt that the ones in the middle and the right that had roughly a 1-to-5 proportion horizontally or a 1-to-5 proportion vertically identified cities and urban areas, and so went from a neighborhood business district to a downtown intensity. What's being proposed by some is going to a golden mean vertically. So if you add 3 stories, you're going to have a golden mean vertically, and to complement that, I'd say that you can look at the golden mean horizontally, which actually works in Georgetown. And so when you look at wonderful city context, or what I would call aspirational city context, why do you want to live in the DC? You want to live in places like this, right? And so you roughly want to live in a place that's either a horizontal golden mean to a vertical golden mean, and that feels like you're living in a wonderful city, like DC. Above, you can see the original Height Act. Oh, and there were better diagrams earlier. There are a number of places in DC we've already exceeded the golden mean. DeSales Street between the Mayflower Hotel and 1133 Connecticut is one, G Place, and new private right-of-ways in City Center and the Wharf are both taller than the golden mean. What's interesting about City Center is that beautiful balloon and umbrella cap they put in actually establishes a new golden mean at the street. Okay. And so the question I'm going to ask, are there other better places to build before going vertical in the downtown? Does building higher in the downtown central core help housing affordability? I'm going to try to delve into these issues in the 15 minutes I've got. So there's 34 million square feet of space, which roughly 15 to 20% is vacant. So that's 5 million square feet of vacant space right now in office buildings. One thing you need to know, this is very important to what happens in real estate, is the comparative book values of office space to residential. Office space is carried at roughly double the book value of any residential. And anybody I talk to, they have different numbers in these ranges here, but they always say it's double. And this is really critical because what it does, if you try to add the 3 stories and convert to residential, you'll never get to people's basis in their property by converting to residential. So it doesn't help the developers. I love this plan. This plan is from 1878. And what it shows is that the relative real estate value hasn't changed for 145 years. This was the case in the Hayes administration in 80, it was the same in the Carter administration in 1978, and it'll be the same in 2078. That these are the relative values. So if you go up for 3 stories, the first thing that'll happen is in the core, those folks will immediately get office development in, because they can develop it, they'll make it happen. On the perimeter, they'll say, oh my God, there's already 5 million square feet. Why are we of empty space? We're just gonna build residential. But what's gonna happen is in these nether zones, this development stagnation. And this has been the case in American development, and in Washington, for history, everyone remembers when the NPR building was sitting forlorn for years. And Andrew Trueblood, who regrets not being able to be here today because his wife just had they just had a baby, you can see the development stagnation actually in the plans in his thesis study, and how there's this zone where if we added vertical development, it would induce delayed investment and deferred maintenance in the hopes of landing that prime GSA tenant to take advantage of the highest and best use of office when building out the additional 3 stories for which they now have the rights. So the question was asked, can 30 feet help DC avoid economic disaster? I would suggest it's going to induce more economic disaster. And you see this all over the United States. You don't see this in Europe. You know, they had a world war and they rebuilt their downtown. You don't see this in Tokyo. They rebuilt their downtown twice. But we have these stagnation zones. And the reason I suggest that we have these stagnation zones is real estate FOMO, which is the fear of missing out of getting that office space. So you look and, you know, this is Cleveland. Cleveland has this opportunity to build these ungodly tall buildings, but they can't do it because these landholders are like, oh, I really want to get that office tenant. I really want to get that office tenant. Where if this wasn't an issue, they could just build and get it done like Europe does, like Tokyo does. And so what we need to find is there should be no impediment to conversion between office and residential and type 1 commercial buildings. These conversions should be allowed automatically across the United States. You know, because the office world is built upon having 10-year leases and 10-year outlooks. And if we could simply allow the office developers to soft fit their buildings for short-term residential, many will take advantage of that opportunity. They'd still be able to carry the building then as a commercial asset, or at least feel like they can realize that value in the future, right? So, but in the US, there are too many governmental hurdles and restrictions that need to be removed between conversion of type 1 downtown buildings between office and residential. Design is not one of those hurdles. This is a building that one of my partners, Jonathan Johnson and Daniel Ashterry did. It's 116 feet deep. It's a mid-block building. And it's wonderful units. This unit type can solve any suburban office building. And these are wonderful units. These are units people want to live in and live that urban lifestyle, live that transit lifestyle. And you can do this in a 120-foot deep building. So any office building in DC can be converted to residential and be wonderful. But what's holding us back in these conversions are the building codes and other restrictions. When we convert, we have to upgrade the buildings because a lot of code officials don't let us convert to residential under the existing building code. They require energy envelope upgrades because the codes have new energy requirements. They require stair and riser tread adjustments because they're slightly different. They require stair railings to be changed. They require, you know, there's separation requirements in the code that are now a little different than they were, and oh, well, your stairs don't meet code anymore. And then some of the major building systems have to be converted. And then on the exit strategy, we have impediments for institutional asset holders to, if they had residential, to move those tenants out and convert back to office. And these restrictions, if they went away, we'd have a lot more active use of our downtowns because people could flex between the two. And having flexible space, getting rid of these restrictions like they do in Europe and like they do in Asia would make America a better place. So where else can we grow? There are a lot of infill sites. This is 1 block from the mall. There's a big parking lot, right? You know, some talked about Friendship Heights and perhaps Fort Totten. Fort Totten, you have 3 different metro lines coming in one place. It's very forlorn. Some people call it Fort Rotten, right? You know? If you allowed the office conversions, you can get 4,000 units. That's like a few that's half of the office space, you know? The remaining undeveloped density within the current height limits of the L'Enfant plan is another 14,000 units. Undeveloped sites, another 6,000 units. Hill East is going to bring in 2,300 units. if you didn't build soccer fields north of the stadium and put a new metro station in by Oklahoma Avenue, you could get another 2,300 units there. North Capitol at Irving Street, this huge cloverleaf. Our office, John Torti, led an example for Crystal City of where they took Route 1 and converted it from a suburban roadway system to a more urban road. And if you look between the two plans, there's all these new development sites that opened up there, right? We could do the same thing at Irving and North Capitol and create a circle like we have at DuPont Circle or Scott Circle or Thomas Circle, where one road goes under the other. And guess what? Another 2,000 units. So John talked about this yesterday, but I need to bring it in now. This is the rough current economic for construction in this area, U.S. And it goes from single-family home construction at 140 a foot to concrete downtown high-rise construction at 280 a foot. Notice it's double the price. So if you can build housing at that price over there, you can get twice as much housing. And luckily, the district passed a law that allows for ADUs across the city on all residential properties. That would be at the lowest price point. There's 94,000 units in the district, single-family residences and townhouses. If half elected to build ADUs, that's 47,000 units. Okay? So let's talk about mixed use a little bit, because there's different price points in building mixed use. At the high end, you can build concrete or steel, type 1. You can also, there's a new type coming to the fore, which is the post and beam 18-story wood buildings. These are the only two types that you could build in the central core with the new heights. You can't build any other type into the central core that's proposed. And they're $260 to $280 a foot. 30% savings if you build below 85 feet. And so where can you build below 85 feet? Because if you build in the district center, the market, this is from the DC Policy Center there, I'm not going to go into it, but basically there's only a few hundred units that are in condo or rental buildings downtown that are in the 1,000 per square foot range. And so if you build downtown, what you're going to be building are wealth storage units. You know, these are units for folks who are hedging against inflation and not living here, right? We want to build for people who are going to live here. And there's a problem, I think, with the comp plan, that if you look carefully between the transit map and the comp plan, and this is a later plan than Harriet, I saw Harriet's had more corridors in it. You know, where are the transit corridors in the current comp plan? Do you see them there? They're kind of hidden, aren't they? And so great precedence exists for densification amongst our transit corridors. Connecticut Avenue is a great example we can all look at. The RB corridor added 37 million square feet on their transit corridor, that one missing corner of the district, right? One transit corridor, 37 million. Let's say we take half of that because we don't want to go as tall. You know, that's still 23 million square feet, or 22,000 units, a corridor. And so we could build the transit corridors with these kinds of buildings. These are all type 3 or type 5 wood podium buildings that we've done. They're much less expensive to build. They're inherently more sustainable than concrete or steel. And they're inherently flexible, use flexible at the ground floor because they are concrete. So you can put retail in the future or do residential and go back and forth with these building types. And they're cheaper. And one more thing about these types, this is a type 5, which are slightly less expensive. We're so used to pricing type 5 construction with the associated privatized mobility that we don't realize what the density could actually be if it's based on a transit model. That you get triple the density of a surface park arrangement by not privatizing the mobility and having transit. So here's the comp plan showing on the left where the mixed-use districts, and there are 47 different kinds of mixed-use districts now in the District of Columbia. And they kind of start to show where the corridors are, but they're very tentative. And why do we need 40 of them? How do we really make a city that's polycentric? And we can start by simply putting circles, quarter-mile circles where the transit stations, where the metro stations are, and then emphasizing all the high traffic bus line. So a high traffic bus line in the district now is a bus every 12 minutes. And if we reinforce them, I mean, does anyone think this is the District of Columbia? It is. And there's so many of these corridors with untapped potential. You know, this is a diagram from Joe Minicozy. That retail gets the city $9.30 of tax revenue. If you just do 3 stories, you can get 10 times the revenue in taxes by building out the transit corridors with density. The 4-story building will get 12 times the property tax revenue to the city. And then if you ask people for a visual preference on where they want to live in the district, I'm guessing they would want to live in the upper building. You know? And we're starting to get great development in all the wards. This is Ward 8. This is real development. This is our Skyland building. So the people are growing and it's nurturing other life in the quadrants of the city. So the point here is develop amongst the transit corridors, converting the suburban underscaled places to places of city context. Upgrade the streets to aspirational neighborhood business street section and prove that all wards get equal attention, not just focusing on Ward 2. And if we extrapolate this from the RB corridor to the 11 or 12 transit corridors in DC, at 20,000 units each, that's 240,000 units we can get, right? And oh, by the way, this quadrant here, if you look at it, look, the purple in that plan represents every household that is getting a senior property tax exemption, which means that every one of those households is changing ownership in the next 20 years, right? So there's Ward 5 is going to go through a huge turnover in residency, and the young residents are typically a lot less afraid of density. You know, what are they looking for? What are young residents, what's appealing about transit lifestyle? You can see here in this slide. These are images from our projects in this neighborhood here, from the websites of what they're selling and what people are looking for, right? They're not afraid of these kinds of buildings, you know? The new population supports more frequent and efficient transit service. How about a bus every 6 minutes? More neighborhood services and a variety of restaurant options. New buildings along transit will allow the residents within these neighborhoods to age in place. All those seniors can now stop shoveling snow and not taking care of the yard and still stay in their neighborhood, right? So there's a lot of new folks in these neighborhoods who would want these kinds of new polycentric nodes for the city. And so there are 307, you said 360,000 units, housing units in DC today. That number is from the DC Policy Center. If you've been keeping track, this presentation tabulated a way to double that number without raising the heights in downtown, while ensuring a more healthy and vibrant Douglas Commonwealth, meeting community aspirations for what it can be. As of 2020, there are 689,000 residents in DC. You know, in 1950, there were 800,000, as Harriet said. Why do we need to raise the height if we know it all worked well before with 110,000 more residents? And so the last thing I need to say is no need yet to squeeze the pincers of capitalism around the seat of capital. So there's your image. So I have an afterthought, and the quick afterthought. Take a moment to praise the Commission of Fine Arts. They offer huge benefits to the DC community. They elevate the game. In an era when the refinement of profit in the development building industries leads to development formulas of 2 vinyl windows in every bedroom and 3 openings in every living room, so the architect's proficient application of the warranty and installation instructions of the James Hardie catalog are their prime directive, right? We can benefit from having the CFA, and they make mistakes. You know, I think this was this number 2 submission for the World War II Memorial, I think would have left them all more open, but generally, they do great things. They are a lucky federal oversight of a robust architecture review process that you really want anyway, and not a paternalistic burden. Design review boards generally protect us from the atrocious. The purview of the CFA with a new subcommittee like the OGB should be extended to the entire L'Enfant plan if you're going to raise the heights, particularly if there's a density giveaway and the heights are raised, right? But I hope as you feel that I have shown clearly now is not the time. Thank you.
Have at it. Yeah, Ellen's going to talk now. Sit where you like. But make sure you can see the slides.
Yes, where,
Pull the microphone down.
yeah. And let me check out the clicker first.
Yeah, the first test is the clicker.
So, okay. So even though the arrow goes up, it's actually going down. I gotcha. So good morning still. Harriet has provided a great overview and policy framework with respect to the design issues inherent in broad height prescriptions. I want to talk a little bit more about the democracy issue that Harriet indicated, because to have a law passed by the federal body that applies to the heights of the entire city with no demonstrable claim on having an impact on the federal interest is an inappropriate intrusion into local government. This kind of federal outreach would never be tolerated in any other city in the U.S. Imagine Jim Jordan when you told him that the Congress was going to pass height limits for Cincinnati or Youngstown. That would be unthinkable. But we have this ironic situation where Congress established the district as an independent district, partly for fear of their own safety because of the 1783 Pennsylvania insurrection, in which they were attacked by veterans angry about not having received their pay, and the governor of Pennsylvania refused to send aid to support them. Let's see, dial up to 2021, where 1,000 Metropolitan Police Department protected the Capitol while the congressman waited 3 hours for the National Guard to be called to come in from the Pentagon. It just struck me as a little ironic. And the last point here, that the Height Act isn't necessary to protect the federal interest. Another one of the wonderful federal restrictions that we live with is that our comprehensive plan for the District of Columbia, the district elements of the comprehensive plan, have to be approved by the National Capital Planning Commission, which is a federal agency. So we go out through the whole district, we create outreach, we get interest back on what the future land use map should say and all the rest of that. And then if there's any part of it that the NCPC doesn't like, they can absolutely veto that and make us go back and change it. It's important to understand that one more federal restriction on the way we do land use in the city is that the Zoning Act, which established our zoning, 40% of the representatives on that zoning commission are ex officio federal representatives. The Zoning Act specifically says zoning may not be inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. So if there were a relaxation of the height limit and we were allowed to choose where the height would be added to the city, the zoning that would allow that height would have to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So the federal interest, which is being safeguarded by NCPC, would still rule in that instance. But we have a particularly difficult situation now in the district, that we face this huge budget problem because of the demise of office space. There was weakness before the pandemic because of the right sizing of offices. But since the pandemic, as you all know, we've had less than 50% attendance in downtown office buildings. The chief financial officer of the district estimates that is going to cost the district a shortfall of $500 million over the next 4 years. because of loss of property tax revenues, the loss of office worker-dependent retail, all of those tax revenues not coming in. So I think we all seem to agree on the importance of retrofitting office buildings into residential. And that's partly a tax issue. It's also partly to create more vitality on the streets of downtown DC. So in that respect, when Brian tells you about all kinds of other places that we could put housing, the downtown is the heart of the city. If our heart is characterized by vacant retail space after vacant retail space and nobody on the streets, that is not what we want to show the world as the picture of what the District of Columbia is like. And therefore, that's a problem that we need to focus on. A height change to 160 feet would give most office buildings in DC an additional 3 stories. The estimates that were prepared by the Director of Economic Development at the downtown bid, Jerry Whitcomb, show that that extra 3 feet could make the difference between being able to convert residential and not office space to residential and not. And despite Brian's fairly optimistic assessment of the ability to do that, let me talk to you about a few difficulties. This is a building, the former Peace Corps headquarters, which is now in the process of being converted. But residential conversions are extremely complex. DC, trying to encourage that, DC has offered a 20-year tax abatement. But although there's great interest on the part of office building owners in taking advantage of that, of the 11 projects which have gotten to the point of being announced, only 2 are actually under construction. And with regard to the problems that Brian cites with building codes and whatever, that's not an either or, it's a both and. If we have interest and financial pro formas that show it can be possible, the city can always do what New Jersey did a couple of decades ago, add a Chapter 13 to the building regulations that say if you've got an existing structure, you can get relief from all of these other restrictions. For, they realized that if the building code said 12-foot wide corridors, but you had 11-foot wide corridors, you were not going to rehab your building. When very shortly after New Jersey passed that relaxation of the codes, New Jersey saw a huge explosion in development because people could finally get the flexibility to rehab the older buildings. The kind of building that Brian showed you that could be, that has been converted to residential is really totally atypical to the buildings that are suffering from vacancy rates now that are potential conversions to residential. As you all, since many of you are architects, know, you've got to have windows within a certain distance of the living space or it's not going to be attractive. And most of our office spaces have huge floor plates. Or the obsolete office buildings are in the center of the block. This one works because it's on a corner space. And the other thing that is really important for being able to convert a building is having it be a single tenant building. Because if you've got multiple tenants there and they've all got different lease expiration dates, it's going to be extremely difficult to convert your office space to residential. Plus the older buildings need code changes. I would say that Brian's economic assessment is totally out of date. First of all, the notion that GSA tenants, that there are office building owners that will be taking advantage, that will want to use that additional 3 stories for GSA tenants, those guys will be waiting a long, long time. Or maybe they haven't been reading the Business Journal and the GSA press releases about GSA's desire to shrink their rental space. In addition, the office versus residential values, I would say, have could not possibly have been based on a realistic assessment of current office values. That's one of the reasons we have a $0.5 billion economic shortfall, because those office buildings are not worth what they used to be. Can I, let's see.
Yeah, you need this.
Yes. A little liquid.
Oh, jet fuel
there. From 1989 to 1991, I was part of a very small group of folks from the local chapter of the American Planning Association and others that introduced zoning that would have required residential in the traditional office area of downtown, from the White House to the Capitol. That requirement for residential was fought so vehemently by the commercial office developers that it took 2 years and God knows how many public hearings to finally get agreement on taking those areas that had been designated mixed use in the comp plan to be zoned for residential. And the argument was, oh, office space is so much more valuable than residential. No one would want to live downtown. No one would want to rent office space downtown. Well, you know what? After the recovery from the 1991 savings and loan crisis, the first set of buildings that were built under that zoning were residential buildings, because it turned out that the developers found out they actually could get a good rental rate from residential. And that is certainly the case now. So I think that the notion that there's an economic disadvantage to converting office to residential is false. I just wanted to mention on Harriet's part, and I'm sure you will go into this in more detail, that the Irving Street in North Capitol area that Brian mentioned is one that the Office of Planning specifically looked at trying to recapture, and were frustrated by the federal highway administration. Oh yeah, did Matt have something to do with that too? With regard to the densification of Connecticut Avenue, which Brian raised as an example, those lovely 90-foot buildings that line Connecticut Avenue, and I live right by them, are not dense. The FAR is 3.5. That's why they have surface parking lots and a lot of green around them. So that is not a model for densification based on adding additional height and density. With regard to the other sites that are possible for infill, sure. But again, why should that be an either or? Why not a both and? Yes, we had 800,000 residents in 1950, but the family sizes were much larger, so they were in a smaller number of units. So the ability to get that extra 3 stories could be critical for saving downtown DC. But some other arguments we ought to think about with regard to the Height Act is, first of all, if we're talking about the quality of design, the famous K Street box, which is what we get because of the height limit, is not exactly what I would posit as a great contribution to the quality of urban design. I'd also note that those great viewshed pictures that we've seen from Justin and Brian, did you notice they're all taken from the middle of the street? So any of you that would like to stand in the middle of North Capitol so you can appreciate the value of the lower buildings, welcome to it. Also, some additional benefits I'd mention quickly from the Height Act, from relaxing the Height Act, is if we had more intensity in the downtown, if we had more height, if we had more residential, we'd have more street vitality. We faced enormous pressures, especially in the early 90s, from the office buildings to push out from the center of the city because they had no more space to create office in the center of the city. And as a result, when you only have an 11-story or 12-story building, there's just not enough people there to provide a great market for downtown department stores and downtown retail. So additional development, particularly residential, would help. We could also premise getting the use of the additional density on creating more affordable housing as we have now with the inclusionary zoning. If you are building a residential building of 10 units or more in the district, you have to provide, you get a mandatory bonus of 20%, of which at least half has to go for affordable housing, because we worked out the proportions, and it turned out that a one-for-one reward of bonus density for affordable housing equaled out, canceled out on the pro forma. So with additional 3 stories of bonus density, we could insist on additional affordable housing, particularly in the downtown, because in order to encourage housing downtown, long before inclusionary zoning, we had we allowed buildings to go to a maximum of the height limit, and we therefore had no bonus density we could give, so there's no inclusionary zoning requirement in the downtown. We also could do a similar thing with funding for Metro, which, as we know, needs it. So the benefits of a minor lifting of the Height Act are, I think, as we can see, really substantial. They certainly shouldn't be held hostage to the height of fire ladders in 1909, or to outrage over the Cairo, a 124-foot building that we now regard as an architectural gem. So in short, that's our case for increasing the Height Act. Thank you.
Okay. Sitting there listening, I was sometimes thinking I was at either a city council meeting or an ANC meeting. Yeah, you locals know what I'm talking about. And I'm reminded when Ellen was talking about K Street sitting in an AIA awards jury for a debriefing from the people who were handing out the awards, which are architects from other towns. And one of the people on the jury said, you know, I really feel bad for you people in Washington. You would have such better buildings if you could build them higher. And I said, you mean like Paris? You know, Paris would be ever so much better if we could get to 30 stories everywhere. And she kind of looked at me, and I went, you know, it's part of the problem of K Street is that architects have forgotten to how to make good facades. And good urban building is not the height. That is not the problem. It's not the height. Okay, so let's get into some debate here. I was sitting down while I was listening to you all. Thank you all very much. That was an incredible amount of stuff in a very short period of time. And I know I want to go back and look at each one of these presentations and cogitate over them sometime in the future, because there's an incredible density of things. But I was sitting there thinking, well, how would I characterize each of the presentations? So with Justin, what we have is the historian. Let's keep it the way it is, because history tells us that's a good idea. And like most histories, it's not neutral. It's from a biased point of view. So Justin gave us a good sense of history, along with a little bit of shock and awe with those pictures there that are, you know, sort of expressing sort of the worst case scenario. Brian is the builder-developer. Let's build out what we have first, and let me do it. You know, let's build out the city. I know where to do it. Let's build it out. I can make it happen. He's the builder. Harriet, I think, is the surgeon. Let's figure out what vitamins the future patient needs and make sure we surgically apply them in a way that makes sense and assures our future. And of course, Ellen is the zoning policy wonk, who knows the financial end and the policy end. And undercurrent of both Harriet's and Ellen's presentations is the sort of ongoing issue about what is actually the role of federal government in terms of the local government of Washington, D.C. So the question I have for Justin and Brian to start with, you all have stated your positions rather clearly, and maybe I'll throw a few questions out there, and I'm sure that you all here in the audience want to throw some things up there. But if you could do all the things you guys value, such as the view corridors and the sense of the federal city and all the different reasons for why we appreciate Washington that you all articulated so well, why wouldn't you surgically change some things if you could preserve all of that? Why wouldn't it be possible to change some things with either setbacks or selected places where the height could change and things like that? Is it really Are we saying no just because historically it hasn't been that way, or because Brian says we have a lot of room to build in other places? If we can actually plan for the future and make those adjustments, as Ellen has articulated so well, why wouldn't we do that? Isn't there a way to be able to kind of have it both ways, or is that impossible? I think your mics are on, so if you guys want to respond to that.
Okay, I'll go first. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with building in the core, but I just think there's 5 million square feet that can be filled.
Hold it up closer to your mouth.
There's 5 million square feet that could be filled first. And how do we fill it? And I think this is where I end up being on the right side of things, which is saying let the market decide. Take away some of the red tape that's holding the redevelopment back. I like the idea of looking at what New Jersey's done in the past. I think that's a bridge to success for the downtown core. We're always open for adjustments and tweaks, and through that process it'll happen. There are other challenges. You mentioned yesterday post-tensioning in buildings, and that creates more, because you have to find the places to drill, it's going to make the buildings
a challenge.
efficient. It's a challenge. That's the biggest challenge, actually, with some of the older buildings. But the product types are there. I think there's a way of getting that in mid-block office building to be great residential, and so that's not the hurdle anymore, and I think the hurdles are different. And I think, and some of the hurdles are mental. I mean, again, it's truly FOMO, and it's not just in the residential to commercial, it's also in the retail. Everybody wants that credit tenant, and they don't want to put other people in and have those artist studios go in day one to make the street life more active. Those are things that would make communities alive. Our project, the Monroe Street Market, there wasn't ever going to be real retail on that strip leading to the metro, and so the notion of working with the district to bring in artist studios and having a program and a way of activating that frontage has been a phenomenal success, and I think those kinds of successes.
So your answer is maybe. Your answer is maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, if you could control it. Justin, you want to respond?
Well, I would say first, looking at the slide Harriet presented, I think it was around Florida Avenue of 200-foot buildings, did not inspire me about what Washington would look like if we were to build, even, in such areas. I also think it's important to remember that, or to note that the Height Act does not take into account elevation. So if you're building buildings outside of the topographic bowl, they're going to have an even stronger effect on the skyline than if you're building in downtown. And so if we try to have these surgical centers, already they're going to do great damage to the skyline. I mean, I think it's very interesting. Back when, before Roslyn had become as high as it has become, the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, even though they don't have jurisdiction over that area, we're trying to fight it, saying that already Roslyn's going to do damage to the region when it comes to vistas. You look from say the Capitol looking west, you see these banal, generic skyscrapers in Roslyn, and if we're not careful and try to be surgical, fine arts, even though they don't in other areas of D.C.
Do you think that's automatically follows, Harriet, in terms of, you were making a point about controls and regulation and things like that. Do you think what Justin just said automatically follows that would be the result?
No, I don't. And I think it's a function, like, people don't just build buildings. There has to be a demand, right? There has to be feasibility. And I would also just say that in the presentation earlier today about and kind of a social equity score, that access to things was given a lot of weight. So what's our biggest job center in DC? It's downtown. What would be the value to people of being able to put, thousands of units of affordable housing downtown, mixed in with market rate housing, mixed in with the biggest concentration of jobs? I mean, it's not as if putting those jobs, putting that housing in Friendship Heights or putting them at Fort Totten, it doesn't give you the same access. So, part of what we're trying to solve for in the city is how to make it better for everybody, right? And and in this particular case, it was like once in 100 years. How is the Height Act working for us? Would we have another chance? before the next 100 years to answer the question. So I think a lot of the illustrations that we've got a chance to see today, a lot of the photo montages had to do with the things we love about the district and we want to preserve, but also the things that constrain us from being the city where everybody living in it can have the convenient, beautiful, affordable, safe, and sustainable way of living that some people here get to enjoy, but not everybody. So I think I love aesthetics. You know, I love history, I love architecture, but in a real city, the question is, how do you balance those things? And I think that this is not just about architecture. I mean, all of our conversations have talked about using urban design as a principle for figuring out how we make these changes. And I don't think that anything that was presented as an actual option does real violence to that.
So Brian, question to you then is, what the argument Harriet's making is that yes, we want a more equitable city, and I don't think anybody's going to, argue about having a more equitable city and more access. But does adjusting things in certain places make an equitable city more possible in areas where it's harder to achieve? Because your presentation, you're saying we have 5 million square feet we could build, but that's not everywhere. It's in some places, but not other places. And it sounds to me like what Harriet's saying is, well, yes, but if we really want to make access an important thing, we have to focus on some places more than others.
I don't think I disagree. I think you can take some of downtown into other polycentric centers of the city like Fort Totten or Friendship Heights. And I think in the 5 million of empty square feet in downtown, you certainly can have a range of housing options. You can sell some of it off and have condos. You can have market rate rental, and you certainly can have affordable rental. And it would be even better if that affordable rental was on a schedule that allowed for that asset to be see its full vision in the future. If someone thinks commercial is going to be more valuable in the future, which you question, but that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Ellen. Do you want to add to that?
Well, I just think on the issue of equity and infill, we have corridors. The one I know best is Connecticut Avenue, and as it was laid out by Senator Newell and Chevy Chase Land, it was deliberately laid out so that the more expensive large single-family detached houses were built within a very short space of the commercial corridor. And now that we are trying to look at it and retrofit and create more height and density over the retail so we can get a greater variety of housing types and a greater diversity of population, we can't be, or we face enormous constraints and resistance because that there's such a jarring discontinuity between these very low density and very expensive single family houses and the ability, the very limited, because of the shallow lots, very limited capability to put more density and more development there. So it's a high intensity bus corridor and it's close to Friendship Heights, but that kind of development pattern has precluded a lot of our ability to do the kind of infill to get to the 5 million.
So it seems like one of the things Justin was saying is a sort of camel's nose under the tent theory, that if you open it up, then the horse is out of the barn and you can't control it. What do you all think of that? Do you agree with that? I mean, is that something you've experienced? Because that, I think, was a little bit the implication of what you're saying, is once you make that step towards changing things, then you really don't have control to change things after that. You're at the mercy of whatever people say the height should be, and there's very little control. Harriet was suggesting, I think, that there is in fact controls in place. Do you all want to opine or respond to that? Because I think, that was one of the implications. It's always in whenever you change something, well, if you do that, it sets a precedent for changing it all the time.
Just briefly, I think the city and its residents love the federal city and the mall and
if not the federal government.
Right. But I was just going to say that we love that part of the city. The feds don't love us back, and this is an example of it, to put this arbitrary height limit on the rest of the city. Harriet, I think you wanted to.
I was just going to say that Ellen went through all the ways in which, even absent the Hyde Act, there's a lot of federal control over what happens in the city. Too much. right? And yes, there's a world where the District of Columbia is largely a federal enclave with some vestigial residential, around the edges, but it wouldn't be the place that we all know and love. There wouldn't be any place to have a restaurant. There wouldn't be, there wouldn't be the vitality, the cultural life, everything else. So I think that it's kind of a chimera to suggest that preserving the city in amber, every part of the city, not just the federal city, but preserving it as is, and not allowing any changes will make it possible for it to thrive in the future. I think we know the way this is going. If we cannot continue to add capacity for, especially for housing, just a more and more expensive city, and fewer people able to afford to be here.
Does adjusting the Height Act have anything to do with taking the pressure off gentrification?
I mean, the adjusting the Height Act, isn't going to have an enormous effect with existing buildings that are getting a few extra stories, but there are parts of the overall city that have capacity for growth, as Brian suggested, and that not having to be constrained in those places by those limits could absolutely provide important capacity, but also create a much more vital mixed-use environment. I mean, I think that what cities are going to experience around the country, this commute to the center, you mentioned polycentric. I mean, there's an office building's worth of people in every residential neighborhood in America practically these days, but we don't have the convenient land uses, right? We still have the single-purpose zoning in a lot of places that prevent you from being able to buy a cup of coffee in that neighborhood or meet somebody for lunch. So I think a lot of us see changes coming to zoning everywhere, making it less exclusive, making it more mixed use, and agreeing that in some places, part of how that has to happen is it really intensify the uses.
Yeah, I want to add to this because I don't think if you picked up on something. I'm actually worried about NIMBYism in D.C., that these neighborhoods are going to gentrify and they're going to lock out. And it's happening already.
You're worried about NIMBYism?
Yeah, NIMBYism, because it's already happened. Like
A few of others are,
well,
too.
but they don't have a state of California that's going to come and say, hey, we got to fix things a little bit, right? Which is with the
Well, we did get the penthouse law changed. I mean, that did change, and that's
sure.
That's significant.
Sure, but between Harriet's period and now, a lot of the district has actually downzoned the transit corridors. Petworth used to be able to go taller. North of Georgetown used to go a little taller, and they got shrunk a little bit. And that's a
But didn't the FLUM increase? Didn't the recent rezoning comp plan increase development intensity in a lot of places?
In some, but not all. There's, I mean, so that's the danger. Yeah, and
It hasn't caught up yet.
Yeah, and so if it goes to complete home rules as its own state, it'll be the one jurisdiction where the state and city are the same.
For those of you from out of town, the FLUM is the future land use map.
The land use plan.
We people in D.C. toss FLUM around like, we breathe,
But
it's.
there are other places that do it differently. Like if you look at Australia, their planning is all state level. They have very vigorous local outreach, but the power is actually vested in the state. And so they have better transit coordination, better consideration of what the global planning is, as compared to here, where occasionally California and other places have to fight to get the affordable housing into some local communities.
Justin, make a comment, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience, please.
Sure. So I wanted to speak to your question about the camel's nose under the tent. I mean, I can't think of a major American city that once it loosened or eliminated height limits just didn't keep getting taller and taller. Harriet and Ellen have criticized home rule, saying, well, we need to trust Washington. We need to trust the leadership in Washington, D.C., the municipal leadership. Well, if we had trusted them, in 1971, the D.C. Zoning Commission wanted to allow 250-foot buildings in the area of the Metro Center metro stop, 250 feet. And the Capitol building is only 289 feet. And I can assure you that
1971, we didn't have home rule. We were governed by a federal commission.
No, but you're talking about intent.
What
Okay,
I'm
go ahead,
saying
finish your
is,
thought.
then the zoning commission, DC proposed legislation to Congress at that time. Of course, it failed. But if DC had had its way, we would have hideous 1970s and 1980s skyscrapers downtown that are 250 feet tall.
I would say differently. You would have a center of that, and then you'd have a dead zone like every other American city.
And I should say, at the time, the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, the Federal Review Board for Washington, fought back against that proposal. And one of the commissioners, Gordon Bunshaft, one of the great designers of skyscrapers in America, he said, if D.C. is not a horizontal city, I'll eat my shirt. So that's what the Fine Arts Commission, including skyscraper builders, thought in the 1970s. And more recently, the chairman, or in 2013, the chairman of the City Council, Phil Mendelson, was asked by Darrell Issa, because Mendelson has been a very strong opponent to changing the Height Act. Issa said, well, this is very strange that, here the City Council wants to give, leave the power in Congress. And Mendelson said, well, the residents of DC don't trust the municipal government to make the right decisions regarding the Height Act. And in 2014, the Washington Post did a poll of DC residents. 61% opposed changing the Height Act. When there were hearings, public hearings regarding the Height Act, in one case, 94% of the people who showed up opposed changing it. So it's not as if, democracy is being squelched in Washington, D.C. And, there's this question regarding home rule. Who's going to have the biggest influence on municipal government? It's going to be the well-heeled and the well-connected. So the question here is,
How long have you been in this town? I'm not sure that's true.
Well,
That's
but-
not been my experience.
well, but since we have Congress control, congressional control, we have national democracy versus what could be local plutocracy.
All right.
I mean-
Go ahead, Harriet. You want to respond to that? Sure.
I'm very concerned about the characterization that that support for home rule is I won't even go there, but democracy is something that we're talking a lot about in our country, right? We're talking a lot about the rights to be able to make your own decisions, and whatever. I mean, Phil Mendelson might be the NIMBY in chief in the entire city. I mean, the fact that in the moment he would advocate for DC statehood, and then say to members of Congress, but I'm just between you and me, we can't be, the citizens can't be trusted to make their own decisions. I mean, that's essentially what that statement is.
Yeah, I think that's a whole nother debate. I would historical hypotheticals are always a little bit tricky, If Corsica hadn't become French, Napoleon's career is down the tubes. So I think you got to be a little bit careful with that. So why don't we open up to some questions? Steve, let's start with Steve here. Get an out-of-towner here to ask a question. We have a microphone for Steve? Yeah. We have one. We only have one mic? Oh, one online question. All right, after Steve, we'll do the online question. Go ahead, Steve.
I can't believe I'm even asking this question, but sorry, let me get away from the speaker there. After hearing all of the discussions about about the impacts of trying to do the conversion, theoretically the conversion of office to residential is one thing, but the very real code issues, I'm wondering, will someone do an economic analysis of when is it better to actually take the building down and rebuild than to try to do the difficult process?
Yeah, so
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'll take this. Part of what I was trying to address was that there's a possibility you don't need to do that. If you get to a point where you can flex buildings indeterminately, it's more sustainable, it's better, and we're getting closer to that, but it's not perfect. There are some developers who are interestingly, they're taking down towers of office buildings to the second level, reinforcing the podium, and then going up with water light gauge. And so that's a methodology, and then you get a better footprint for the residential. Some are taking the buildings down all the way. And what's happening with office conversions, mostly in DC, is that they do the analysis, and because of the code restrictions, and because you have to replace the envelope anyway, at that point, you're only left with the structure, and then why bother, and then they take it down. And so that's the math that's being done all over, and not just in DC, but suburban, the region as well.
It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think we have an online question there. Matt, if you want to read it.
Yeah, we have a online, more of a comment from Catherine Johnson, and so bear with me, there are a few typos here. Using the Cairo as an example for why we should raise the height must be accompanied by requirements like limiting facade width. Footprint is 120 feet wide, 108 feet deep, and facade is elegant and traditional. Limiting facade width is just as important as height. We need as many doorways per block face as possible.
Okay. Let's see, Murphy.
Sorry.
Yeah, use the mic, please. Okay, yeah, we'll get to you. We're coming around.
So I really appreciate all the discussion, and like any kind of conversation and debate, Ellen said several times and Matt said it both and I think that that's probably where we wind up. We've had 3 days of conversation about what I would characterize as humane density, how to deliver density humanely and with urbanism, and I think you can do that at 90, at 110, at 130, and 160. But I want to bring it back a little bit to Harriet and Ellen's comments about democracy and self-determination in the district and ask kind of a tough question, and maybe it is too local. If eliminating congressional control over the Height Act is one thing that we're talking about, that would not be the one that I would start with in terms of self-determination for land use and decision. The PUD appeals, the negotiated entitlements that we have in the district and many cities have, automatically, when they get approved through the district, through our own self-determination, and then automatically get appealed, that goes to a federal system. So my question to you is, if you were going to pick one version of removing congressional oversight of our own land use and planning decisions, and hopefully we get to a states' rights position where we don't have to do it, would you pick the PUD appeals? Would you pick the Height Act? Would you pick something else? It is a bigger issue than just the height and density discussion in that way.
Ellen might have a different answer, but I will say no one has ever asked us, would you like the appeal route for your PUD decisions to go a different way, in which case we'd say absolutely. We were asked for the first time in 100 years, how's the Height Act working for you? That's the reason that something at all happened. But Ellen.
Well, I'd also add, Murphy, that I've had discussions with some council staff about the importance of tightening the standing requirements to sue. Right now, pretty much anybody could say, oh, I'm affected by this planned unit development, and lodge a suit and tie up or lodge an appeal and tie up a case for at least a year without ever having to put down any money or have any skin in the game.
$150 is all you need to do.
Yeah, that's right, $150. So that in and of itself would make a lot of sense, because those of you that aren't familiar with our PUD process may know that we had strongly encouraged developers, when they applied for a planned unit development, to get extra height and density. We basically, the Office of Planning had held their feet to the fire and said, we're not going to support this extra height or density unless there's a substantial increase in affordable housing. So we had hundreds of units that had been approved by the Zoning Commission and then appealed, and because there was a change in the composition of the DC Court of Appeals, which is not a DC court, it's a federal court, the court, which had always in the past deferred to the Zoning Commission as the interpreter of what was consistent with the comprehensive plan, decided, even though the Zoning Commission considers that stuff every Monday and every Thursday and every Monday meeting, and was very familiar with it, that people who had absolutely no experience in the comp plan or zoning could overrule the appeals. So it's
Ellen, sounds like you have a little bit of experience in this. Brian, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to add that so for those that don't know, the PUD process allowed for much higher heights, but at a cost of having to prove an exceptional development. And what's happened, and this is something that the a lot of the threat, if you do a PUD, the height levels have come down for the PUD, but the base density levels in DC generally have gone up. So it's a lot easier to do more density without having to go through the PUD process now, and I have to say that.
Robert Orr.
Okay, thank you. Couple questions. If the density of New York City, and let's say that they have some tall buildings, is 63 people per acre, according to Mallory on whatever the first day was. Paris, which doesn't have as many tall buildings, has 83 people per acre, and Beacon Hill in Boston has 93 people per acre. Why are we having this discussion? Why aren't we making more 4 to 6 story Beacon Hills? Eliminating the car, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing is, what do we think about La Défense? Does that help Paris?
I try not to
hurt
think
Paris?
about it too much, but
Are we looking at the past? Is that being historical to say we shouldn't have La Défense, we should keep Paris? Is Paris just this museum to go visit, or do people actually live there and like living there? If we allow tall buildings, how far away should they be? I mean, is the La Défense a carbuncle? Or does it support, do people go to Paris to see La Défense? They enjoy being in the L'Étoile and looking out at the La Défense. Also,
you got a lot of questions here. You want us to take them one at a time?
I have one other one because I know there are a lot of other people. Income. The trouble with affordable housing is it's not affordable. We talked about that yesterday, and we actually had a lot of talk about what is affordable and how to do affordable. And if we could replat lot sizes so that the lot sizes are affordable, you can get mixed income. In other words, have different size lots, give some incentive for people that own large properties to create small lots. So
let me see if I can rephrase your points into some questions for them to deal with. So first of all, I think what Robert's saying is if all these other cities have appropriate densities and they're low-rise like Paris or Beacon Hill and things, why are we even considering this in DC? I think that's one question. The second question is, what is the relationship between districts like La Défense, which are high-rise, generally office, commercial use districts, and the city, and are we worried that we might end up with some of that stuff as well? And the third issue I think you brought up is does this really mean we're going to get affordability? Are we really expecting that that's what's going to happen, right? Okay.
So,
Harriet, go first, and then Brian.
So I would just say that some of the things that Brian suggested we do first, we actually have done, right? We basically have accessory dwelling units by right in almost every residential zone in the District of Columbia, right? So we can add density, even to single-family zones. But if you've ever been in a community meeting here, what we call a skyscraper, what neighborhoods call a skyscraper, is a 4-story building. Sometimes it's a 3-story building, right? So the fights are horrific about those kinds of changes, and in a strange way, it's a lot easier to get 3 more floors downtown than it is to get a half a floor, in some neighborhoods. But
I would agree with that.
But the point is that, we like it being low-rise. We're not talking about Manhattan skyscrapers, even in the places where we are talking about potentially adding density. The thing that we didn't talk a lot about, Ellen mentioned that household sizes are decreasing, right? And that in DC more than in the region, more than the national average, right? So the other things we have to do are support transit and other kinds of alternatives to the automobile. In our zoning update that we made that brought us ADUs, we also got rid of a lot of our parking minimums, and where we didn't, we reduced the parking requirements, and we've added, all kinds of transportation options, right? Half of our trips are walk, bike, and transit. There's hardly another American city that can say that. But, so yes, all of that is stuff that's really important, and where the density goes and what the other uses are, those make all the difference in whether or not it's possible to take short trips. And I think there's hardly a place in the district that isn't a convenient distance, at least to a significantly large residential neighborhood, so that you could at least have that walkable convenience or that bike rideable convenience to your destinations in almost every part of the city. That's what we're trying to achieve, if not a law defense or a downtown level of job concentration.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I want to say a couple things to this. First of all, when Larry Beasley gave his talk, he did talk about engaging the community, and I think this is a great question, engage. Do you add the 3 stories, or do we talk about really densifying at Fort Todd, and particularly Friendship Heights? Friendship Heights is bizarre because on the Maryland side, it's already super tall, and so why not, complement that? And so that's a question I think residents could engage on and have a very thoughtful consideration. And the second thing I want to say is that the resident type is changing. The residents from your period of leadership, are segueing out, and they were very NIMBY focused, and I think there's a lot of the younger kids are YIMBY, and I think Ward 5 is really an exciting opportunity where I think they're going to push for heavy growth. I think they're to say, we want Columbia Heights, we want that level of height there, and you can hear that in a lot of the blogs around here. Well, a lot of push for more height, give us more. That makes our community more exciting, more vibrant, and give us the amenities we're hoping for.
I was at a public meeting once. We were doing a master plan, mixed-use master plan for GW, and we succeeded in getting them 2 million square feet in Foggy Bottom. Remember that? And the person from DDOT was testifying, and one of the community members started talking about how all that additional density was going to cause the streets to clog and the air to be poisoned and things like that. And the person from DDOT looked at them and said, well, we like it when the streets are clogged because then people ride transit, But one of the things that's sort of interesting to toss out there is the impact of COVID. I was just in Paris and I almost got hit by a bicycle several times, and people riding bikes all over the place. We have a lot of new bike lanes downtown. I don't see anybody on them, by the way, since COVID hit. So is one of the things that we think that, is COVID really giving us the opportunity to rethink these office buildings and density and how we live in downtown? Because it seems like, the old chief of staff for Obama, Rahm Emanuel, said, never waste a crisis, the opportunity of a crisis. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's part of why we're talking about this today. I think that's why we have even a glimmer of hope that we might look at an additional 3 stories or more exception to the Height Act, because COVID has decimated the vitality of downtown. And now that people don't want to, people want to work from home, it's weakened the office market, whatever. And adding additional height and converting office buildings, you're right, is not the be-all and the end-all. But so we have to do the both and, which also means better parks, open space, reasons for people to want to come downtown even if they don't live downtown. Fortunately, we have the Capital One Arena, and maybe when our teams start winning more people will be coming downtown. But COVID has had an enormous impact on that. And Matt, Scott Brinson's been
Hi. 1, 2.
Okay. Leon Creer memorably characterized suburban drivers coming into the city as mortar fire. And as someone living in the city of DC and who does not drive, I wonder about how your various proposals, the taller buildings or their continued absence, would impact that, would reduce the flow of people driving into DC. If you go around the downtown at rush hour, there's just a tremendous rush of people in cars. And so compared to the height of buildings, that's trivial compared to just seeing the amount of traffic, the cacophony, the pollution, and so forth. And there's a continued lack of vitality despite all the people driving out at rush hour. So how would the height impact that experience?
If the height, if any increment of height or other incentives to convert office to residential, I think you'd have more of the kind of downtown you'd like to be walking through and less of the traffic sewer, you know, that it can sometimes be.
Okay. Scott?
Thanks. I hope this helps with the heights discussion. So there's a number of things that have changed during COVID, but that's as far as the analysis usually goes. What if some of those continue to change? So for example, work from home is going up. Ordering from home and in-person shopping is going up, all right? Confounding, you know, most of our planning standards for this. Household size continues to go down. It's not like it bottomed out and it's coming up naturally again. And more and more commitments are being made to greenhouse gas reduction. And I did a quick look regionally at what's being spent just by households on transportation. So in DC, it's a little over $2 billion per year, but region-wide, it's $30 billion a year. I wouldn't be too quick to give up on the commuting tax. I'd call it something else because I'm not really sure it's mostly about commuting anymore, but people haven't stopped driving. So I think somehow it would be easier to get what you want in DC if you could bring along some of the suburbs to similar, at least functionally, sorts of standards, because it's going to cost a lot of money to achieve the social goals that you talked about. And certainly transportation could be the low-hanging fruit on this, but maybe getting more places to zone for the drop in household size and continuing to build such big units, as you see happening, you could start a trend. So what about going after the transportation costs? One idea that you might want to react to. There's this thing called Scope 3 emissions accounting coming along. That means that off-site emissions, somebody's going to have to be responsible for it. And if you've got more people coming in for what was called commuting anyway than you had planned for, and it's going up, who owns those emissions? You shouldn't have to pay for the emissions reduction that other people are inducing. It's kind of like a supply chain effect. So maybe it's time to reopen what was called the commuting tax effect into some sort of community-wide or region-wide benefits fund.
That's a lot of stuff, Scott. I'm going to stop you right there. The question, let's let them get a question there. Time out.
No, but that, let's get some different opinions on the value.
Can we do a commuter tax or do something and have the suburbs help the problem?
Singapore and Japan have cars where there's a tolling feature built into the cars. And so in the future, if we have autonomous vehicles, you can imagine people will swarm to certain places and the roads will get clogged. And the only way to solve that is to actually put road-to-road road segment tolling, because otherwise people will clog. And as soon as you have road segment tolling like they already have in Singapore, you can solve this issue and get the taxes that way.
One thing I will point out, somebody once said to me, Scott, in answer to your question, the only kind of form of regional government we seem to have in this area that functions is Metro, because everybody has a stake in Metro in WMATA. So, Dhiru?
Thanks. So, I'm Dhiru Sadani. I don't actually have a question. I will say that.
That's highly unusual here. Almost
Right,
everybody has.
yes. But I do have a lot of comments. And I will say I grew up in Bombay and came to Washington 50 years ago. So I'm a resident of Washington, D.C. for over 50 years. And when I came to Washington, it was a terrible place. It was absolutely horrendous, unsafe, and most of Washington, or the street especially, was unwalkable or, and unsafe.
And certain business activities occurred.
Yes,
on
yes.
14th
Several,
Street.
business activities that we can't talk about. And in the last 50 years, my love affair with Bombay and Washington has literally flipped. I came here and I thought, boy, this is a horrible place. And I left India and I left the Paris of the East, Bombay, and I came to the land of opportunity, and my quality of life went down substantially. Okay, and thanks to the work Harriet and Ellen and folks like you have done, Washington has continually been getting better as a city. It's not perfect, but it's continually been getting better. And Bombay has deteriorated to the point where I don't recognize it anymore, okay? Because there's been literally no controls per se. And so we had a great tram system. There is no tram system anymore. You know, and everything, and I use, in some of my talks, I use this as a comparison between the two cities, of what Washington has done correctly and what Bombay has done incorrectly, which makes me very sad because I did love both cities, the former one. So one of the things that I think is missing from all these questions today is the issue of aesthetics and architecture, okay? And in the last 10, 15 years, despite the urbanism getting better in Washington, it has got uglier as a city. I just got new lenses inserted in my eyes, and I really wish I hadn't done that. I'm completely regretting, because now I can see so much. I have 20/20 vision, and I can see the ugliness much more so. And there are parts of Washington, several parts not too far from here, that are absolutely horrendous to walk through. And you don't even know you are in Washington anymore. You could be in any place, anywhere in the world. You got all those ziggy-zaggy buildings, you know, the barcodes, etc. And that quality that was Washington, including the apartment buildings, I know Torti Gallas has been doing a great job at maintaining the Washington quality of buildings that belong, but there has been a whole range of architects who have completely ignored the context. And we're getting buildings here that could be built anywhere in the country or in the world. And as Dan Solomon eloquently put it, stumpies. We're getting them, and those buildings, exist now. It could, and unfortunately, it is getting incredibly. I want to say one thing about the height limit. We're talking about height and affordability. We're not really talking about affordability when we're talking about 80% of the AMI or fulfilling that. The real issue of affordability is the 0 to 30%, okay, of AMI. That's where the real problem lies all across the country. And I don't think anyone, and I might be wrong, but I don't think anyone in the city is really addressing that issue. So when the mayor talks about affordability, it is absolutely out of reach. What she is referring to, and tall buildings are more expensive to build, and therefore absolutely not affordable, okay, in the real terms. It's not solving the real problem at hand, okay? And so, and at least in my work, in my experience, which I will say is limited, the only way you can get affordability, true affordability, is under 3 stories. And that is mostly in rehab of existing buildings and cutting them up so that you make smaller units. And that is absolutely the only way we've been able to reach any level of affordability. And that is for people who are earning, and there's a large majority of this range, which we also, and Scott will give you the numbers.
That's a stick row house scale.
Huh?
That's a stick row house.
Yes, a stick, yes. And, it's a level where if someone is earning, a single household is earning $12,000 a year, okay, in most cities, and that's at 0 to 30 as a single household, or $22,000 a year as a 2-person household, okay? And that's where the real problem lies. That is the largest majority, and we are absolutely moving those people out of the cities completely and not addressing it at all. And there are also the people who can't afford the automobile and the transportation and have to bear the highest transportation costs because they're going so far out. And so they're squeezed on time, commuting time, and squeezed on income and on affordability. So, and I know, Scott, you've done a lot of work with transportation, and thank you for all the data. So I think that's what if you're going to define affordability, we have to think about below 50% of AMI and not, I think the other stuff will fill in automatically. Thank you.
Great. So we're supposed to end at 12:30 here, right? 12:30 we're supposed to wrap this up, and it's about that now. I wanted to give these four people just a couple of minutes to say a final thought that they might want to share with us. And then I have a small final thought that I want to share with you. So Ellen, do you want to start? Final thought, maybe address any of Deeru's comments or anybody else who's made comments?
Yes, just a brief response to Deeru. I agree that the affordability we are severely lacking in tools to deal with lower levels of affordability. It's why it's so important that we invest in our public housing authority and demand accountability and competence from them, which
Amen.
we've not really seen lately. But in addition to that, and I know inclusionary zoning it's one arrow in the quiver, and it's pretty slim arrow. But when we designed inclusionary zoning, we looked at the Montgomery County model, which allows the Housing Opportunity Commission in Montgomery County, once you have produced what they call MPDU, moderately priced dwelling unit, or what we would call an IZ unit, then the Housing Opportunity Commission, since that cost of the unit, the initial cost of the unit is lower, basically because it's been paid for by air, by translating density into an additional unit, then it's easier for the Housing Opportunity Commission to buy that down from the 80 or the 60% AMI level to a 30 or a 50% level, and we need to do that aggressively. But as you know, partly because of our finance problems now, the mayor, who has been committed to more affordable housing, has now had to reduce the amount of money going to affordable housing. So whatever we can do, including
We'll see where that goes. Yeah, we'll see. Brian?
It's the urbanism first, and you upgrade the street sections in the transit corridor before we ever think of downgrading the street sections in the downtown core.
Thank you for your succinctness.
So inclusionary zoning, high rises, these are not the solution to affordability, but the whole totality of what we do in the district is a big part of that, including what Ellen mentioned, allowing ADUs by right, where a lot of the homeowners are not as rent-seeking as commercial landlords, and they rent to people often below market. They rent to family, they rent to friends. You know, all of that is happening. We spend more than $100 million a year in the city, more per capita than any other city in the U.S. on affordability. You can argue about whether we're spending it well or effectively, but we're spending it. And I think the other thing that's important, and Scott and others talked about this earlier, our residents spend 9% of household income on transportation. The regional average is 19%, right? So people find it very affordable to get around DC to meet their daily needs, and that's a big part of how we are able to keep people in the city, whatever their income. But I do think it's something we need to continue to work on.
Okay, Justin, you went first. You can go last here.
Sure. So two areas I want to talk about. The first one is, you know, what is DC's actual position on this? I think it's telling that Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, who represents DC in Congress, has said that she does not support a change to the height limit unless the mayor and the chairman of the city council concur. The chairman, Phil Mendelson, has for a long time said he does not want a change to the Height Act, and Eleanor Holmes Norton knows this, the implication being she does not want a change. The other area I wanted to talk about is the one relating to the example of Paris. In Paris, forget about La Défense. In recent years, they have built their skyscrapers within the periphery, but more, not just the Tour Montparnasse, which was a while back, but the Tour Triangle, the Tour Duo, the Palais de Justice. All of these are examples of star architecture by Renzo Piano, Jean Nouvel, big name architects, and they're just terrible buildings that do not harmonize with the historic character of Paris whatsoever. And that's just the beginning of what could happen to Paris. Or you look at London, which used to be also a low-rise city, that's now an architectural freak show with numerous buildings that people make fun of. And if we're not careful, I mean, we've been talking about residential architecture, but we should not forget that there are always going to be corporations and institutions out there that want prestige architecture. And if they get their way, they'll try to build some kind of distinctive architecture in Washington.
It's nice to live in a city where the star architects were Paul Cray and Henry Bacon. Well, I want to thank our panel, our historian, our general practitioner surgeon, our builder developer, and our policy analyst. Thank you all. So we're going to stay another couple hours and talk about why the buildings are so ugly here in D.C. What do you think, huh? Any opinions about that? Huh? Okay. Did you want to make...
Thank you all for coming. We have lunch for everybody, and the tours are going to start at 1 o'clock in half hour. There are two tours, one that's going to be looking at, well, both tours are going to do the U Street corridor, one led by Brian and one led by Murphy. There you go. And Brian's tour will then, we have metro tickets, right? So if anyone needs metro tickets, we have metro tickets that we can provide to you. The one group, the Classical Washington group, will get off at the archives and walk to the Temperance Fountain. And the second group will go to the Navy Yard baseball. Both groups will meet back at the wharf, and there's a happy hour at Cantina Bambina. It's on your list at 5 o'clock. So both groups land up meeting there, and whoever's left, we'll all party till we drop. So, or I'll drop very quickly. So, okay, thank you all. Please enjoy the lunch.
Let's open the things here so people can go out on the deck.